Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss reviews. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, I'm going over this again because several colleagues have told me that some people are going way overboard on the new review standard. So I'm particularly going to talk about efficiency in this module. Some of these things I've talked about before, but I'm going to give some more efficiency hints, particularly in response to where I've seen people going way overboard. Now, the first thing I've seen a lot of discussion about is the date of the rep letter, how to date it, what to do if the date is before, what to do if the date is after. We draft both of these documents. We draft the rep letter, we draft the review engagement report. It is just simplest if these dates are the same, and then we don't have to have any discussion about before or after. If the dates are not the same, it's a lot more work, and there are steps you have to do and things you have to consider and what's happened between the date of the rep letter and the date of the report. And if they're the same, you don't have to think about it. And the rep letter date cannot be after the report date because, of course, you have to have the rep letter in your hand completed and signed before you can issue the report, before you can date the report. So simplest if they're the same, we draft them, end of discussion. Now the examples in 2400 are, in my humble opinion, too brief. So if you're taking a course or something and the examples they are giving you are from 2400, these are way too brief, my opinion. Now the documentation of the agreement we have, and for reasons more important than the standard says we're supposed to do it. It's just foolish to undertake an agreement if you don't have a clear understanding with your client, is in the engagement letter. And what I see people doing is they use the rather too brief example in 2400, and then there are a number of other things that you have to agree to with the client, and the process is they document those one by one in the file. And the problem with that is you might miss one year, or the problem is that that's just a lot of extra work and a lot of extra documentation. So if your draft engagement letter includes all of the things in the example in 2400 and all of the other things that are required to be agreed with the client in 2400, all in one letter, that's just much simpler. The other thing that the section requires is there are a number of inquiries we are to make of the client. And again, you can document those one by one in the file, or if your representation letter is inclusive of all those things, you just need to get the rep letter signed. The other thing that I see people doing is they go, well, I'm supposed to ask the client this question. So they document on Tuesday, I asked the client, Mary, this question, and Mary told me this answer. Well, that works. That's not wrong. It's just hugely inefficient, and you are at risk that you're going to miss one or two. If you have all of those inquiries, the response to those inquiries in the rep letter, it's apparent that you asked the client because they've answered your question in the rep letter. So that's just far more efficient, and you won't miss things. So having a complete engagement letter, more than the example in 2400, having a complete representation letter, more than the example in 2400, is a much better idea and will be more efficient and more effective. Now, another thing I've seen is long discussions about adjusting all errors. The criteria for doing it, which errors can be ignored, how to discuss this with the client, and I guess my judgment is this is just a waste of time. The few times that I've had discussions with clients about whether or not all errors are to be adjusted, they're surprised and they go, well, why wouldn't you do that? That's why I hired you. That's what your job is. That's why I want you to do this review. I want everything fixed. So that certainly saves a lot of time. There's then no need to evaluate the errors or discuss them with the client or those charged with governance or putting them in the rep letter. And indeed, you might even consider putting in the engagement letter an agreement with the client that anything found will be adjusted, because that is going to make your review much more efficient. Now, there are a number of places where professional judgment is required. It's required in picking procedures, it's required in setting materiality, it's required in determining the extent of documentation, it's required in determining the extent of documentation of the accounting system. Now, as we're developing an approach, we need to decide whether our approach is going to be used by staff with no judgment, or whether the approach we are developing is to be used by staff with judgment who we believe to be competent. Now, this is something of a joke, I guess, because why would we plan to use staff with no judgment? And why would we plan to assume that all of our staff are not competent to do a review engagement? Why would we have such people in our employment? So I think when we're developing an approach, we've got to assume that our staff have judgment, and with supervision, appropriate supervision by the partner, they will be able to execute the assignment without a whole bunch of guidance and standard forms and rules and regulations. Now, procedures, analytical and inquiry. One of the things I see being done is there are, let me say, 30 analytical procedures you could do on accounts receivable. And I see people developing approaches where they say, okay, let's do all 30 analytical procedures. And then there are perhaps another 30 inquiries that could be made. And they go, okay, after having done 30 analytical procedures, let's make 30 inquiries. And if you're using professional judgment, you should be able to determine that perhaps a single analytical procedure is all you need to do, or a single analytical procedure accompanied by a single inquiry. And perhaps that inquiry is in a representation letter. You do an analytical procedure on accounts receivable, you find it's comparable to last year. The client in the representation letter tells you that they're satisfied that receivables are all collectible. Based on your understanding of the client, you decide that's enough. So you don't have to go and do a whole bunch more procedures. I also see people saying that you document who you talked to, the date you talked to them, where you were when you talked to them. And you don't always have to do that. Now, sometimes you may find that's convenient, but you don't always have to. And for instance, the rep letter, well, of course, you know who signed the rep letter, so that will do it for you. The other thing about the representation letter is if the client is responding to you that accounts receivable are appropriately valued, it's implicit in their response that you ask them whether or not they were appropriately valued. So that cuts down a lot on the procedures and what you have to document. Materiality. Now, in an audit, you kind of need to document your rationale for determining materiality. It kind of tells you have to do that, though that doesn't have to be extensive. 2% of revenue is this. 2% of revenue is $9,500. And I thought about that and decided that $10,000 in my professional judgment is material. That documents your rationale. So you could, in a review engagement, document that, but you don't have to because the standard doesn't require it. It just requires you to document a number. So that's all you need to do. Procedures. Now, the other thing I see is what people do is they write a long story about what happened, who they talked to, where they were, whether it was cloudy outside. That's not the target of the procedures. The target of your procedure is, do I think that material misstatement is less than likely? So I talked to Mary on such and such a date and she told me this and they do that and this is what's going on, and they didn't collect this receivable, and on and on and on and on and on. That really has no value because you're not talking about whether or not material misstatement in the area is less than likely. What you need is a statement such as, I compared accounts receivable aging this year to last year, and it's similar. That is a statement that talks about whether or not material misstatement is less than likely. And as long as you come up with an overall conclusion sometime later, which is what's required by the standard, that kind of documentation should be good enough. And it's directly talking about whether or not a material misstatement is less than likely. Now, in audits and in reviews, I see people loving to sprinkle conclusions throughout the file. You can do that. Lots more documentation, lots more work. But particularly in reviews, what the standard requires is an overall conclusion. Someplace at the end of the review, you conclude that you've collected sufficient appropriate evidence and that you've concluded that material misstatement is less than likely. And throughout the file, you will have a bunch of statements like, I compared receivables aging this year to last year and it's similar, and those will be supportive of your conclusion that material misstatement is less than likely. But a long discussion with Mary about what's going on and what happened and a series of facts doesn't directly address material misstatement being less than likely. Documenting the system. CPA Canada has a document where they discuss what should be documented, and it's minimal. And for instance, if we follow their example, documenting the name of the accounting software used and documenting that the bank is reconciled monthly might be enough. You need to use your professional judgment. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you need a bit more. What I see, on the other hand, is people having long templates where they're doing audit-style documentation of how the systems work in a review. Actually, some of the documentation I see might be too much even for an audit, but resist that temptation, use professional judgment, start low and slow, and document, for instance, the name of the accounting software and that the bank is reconciled monthly, and then decide whether you need to document anything else. Maybe you decide, oh, the owner signs all the checks. I'm going to document that too. But start low and use professional judgment to decide when you've got enough. Don't come up with a list of 50 things to document about the system, because that will be inefficient and probably too much. Documentation generally, again, I see people going overboard, so don't. There are very specific requirements of what you have to document, who did it and the date, who reviewed it and the date, conclusions, and a few more. Be sure you do those things. And if you have a system, it'd be really cool if the completion of a checklist step triggered both the initials of the person who did it and the date they did it on, and automated that so that you don't forget to write down the date, because that, of course, would be a classic criticism of your file. Oh, here you forgot to write down the date. Now that's kind of picky, but that is the requirement, so make sure you do it. The rest, the level of the documentation, is left to your judgment. So if we decide that we have staff with appropriate judgment who are being appropriately supervised by the partner, we should be able to come up with an appropriate file. And I guess implicit through what I've said here, we need to continually ask, are we done yet? So the first way you can do it is come up with a very, very long list of questions that will work on any engagement and every engagement. And that will be long, maybe 100 pages, inefficient, and boring. And I really don't want to do that, and I don't want to do that to my staff. I don't want to make their lives inefficient and boring. Option B would be a minimal list for a typical engagement where I expected, in most engagements, the minimal list would be appropriate, but in many engagements, some additional items might need to be documented, discussed, done, and that needs to be driven by the staff's professional judgment, because if I allow for every such possibility in my standard template, it's going to take forever and be boring, and people are going to be inclined to skip things because they know they're not efficient and not effective. And once you start saying, oh, it's okay to skip a couple of questions, then you can skip ones that are perhaps important. So I like option B better. I believe my staff are competent, and with appropriate supervision, they'll make the right decisions. And another thing, using judgment. What I see people doing is saying, here are the 30 things we have to do. Well, no. Collecting evidence is like filling a bucket. And after each inquiry and analytical procedure, we should say, are we done yet? And I think I said this at the beginning. You could do one analytical procedure and accompanied by something in the representation letter say, you know what? In that particular situation, in this particular client, we're done. We don't have to do anything else. So one analytical procedure is enough. And I don't have to do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. This one is the best one to do. I've done it. We're done. So when your bucket is full, you have sufficient appropriate evidence, use professional judgment, document it, and stop. That applies in audits too. Same concept, that we should be incrementally adding evidence. Now in an audit, you're going to have to get more than in a review. In a review, you just have to decide it's, material misstatement is not likely. And perhaps you don't have to do a lot to get to that point. But we need to be asking that question in each section and stopping as soon as we've got enough. So conclusions, things we should do to make sure our reviews are particularly efficient. The rep letter and the report should have the same date. We do them both. Make it the same date. The examples in 2400 for the engagement and rep letter are too brief, and they need to be supplemented by other things that are included in the section. And that then makes our life simpler, and we don't have to do those in our checklist or template. The representation and engagement letter can document a lot of stuff. Talked about that. Adjusting all errors just makes your life simpler. And then use your professional judgment to determine the level of documentation, not somebody else's. In other words, we're not going to use the professional judgment of the person who developed the template, who knows nothing about your client. We're going to use the professional judgment of the staff doing the work and the partner in charge, because they know more about the client than the person who developed the template. And be sure to document the items that are required to be documented. The rest, you can use your professional judgment. So, thanks for listening.